3 biomarkers everybody should track.
You can be fit and healthy and go to the gym and do all the things, and you can have high blood pressure. The number one risk factor responsible for most premature deaths globally is
Simon Hill, nutrition researcher, author, and host of The Proof. He's here to cut through diet myths and show what the evidence really says about eating for muscle, health, and longevity.
My dad had a heart attack. Is that something I need to be careful of because it's genetic and it might run in the family?
The reason that a lot of these diseases are running in families, a lot of the time is explained by the fact that we adopt the same lifestyle.
You have to consume more plant protein to get to the same level of absorption. How much truth is to that?
Do you want to talk about protein absorption percentages, or do you want to talk about your ability to build muscle and strength? I think most people would say,
today on the Hack You podcast, we have our guest Simon Hill, who has built a global platform by making one simple idea impossible to ignore. Nutrition is one of the most powerful levers we have to control how we age. As the host of the Proof podcast and author of The Proof is in the Plants, Simon dives deep into the science behind metabolic health, inflammation, and biological aging. His work shows how what we put on our plates can literally shape how long and how well we live. If you ever thought food was just fuel, this conversation will change your mind. It was very eye-opening how he approached things, how and why he introduced plants more and more into his diet, what the research shows, and how he plans on living better in his 50s and 60s because of the changes he's making today.
And what was very interesting and very nice was that he did not force it down our throats, saying that we have to become plant-based. He was saying that just the introduction of consuming more plant-based products and maybe pulling away from overconsumption of meat can have many advantages to your health and longevity.
He debunked a lot of the myth that is around, including what wearables you should use or what biomarkers are really important. When we talk about the 3 most important biomarkers, he mentioned some that we've never even heard of, and one that costs $40 and you should do every single day. I think this is one of the episodes that will really open your eyes, that we enjoyed very much, and we are sure you will do too.
What's up, guys, and welcome back to Hack You. Simon Hill, thank you very much for joining us today. Looking forward to speaking to you.
likewise, Mike, Vadim, great to be here.
I'm curious to know very quickly how you got into doing what you're doing today.
20 years ago, I walked into my first physiology lecture at La Trobe University in Melbourne. That's where I grew up. And I started with an undergraduate degree in physiotherapy. And I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with professional sport in Australia, but there's a football league over there, which is different to European football, called Australian Rules Football. And I graduated and went and worked as a physiotherapist with AFL football team called Richmond, and did that for a number of years, and then decided I wanted to go back to uni and went back to, this time, to Deakin University, which is also in Melbourne, and did a master's in nutrition science. And from there, came out into the world and was having a lot of conversations around how confused people are with, you know, what should we be eating for performance? What should we be eating for long-term health? And I kind of have carved out this niche where, you know, I hope to provide some clarity in this space where there's a lot of confusion and a lot of seemingly conflicting or contrasting headlines and information on social media. So spans 20 years, and I've been now doing my podcast for about 8 years at this point.
From the things that you learned over those 20 years, does it feel like there's more myths out there than when it started? Or does it feel like we have more information so it's less?
It's hard for me to know if there's more today than there was 15, 20 years ago. I think the longer I've been in this space, the more I become aware of, certainly. But it may have been things that I just didn't recognize, you know, when I had less understanding of this space. I think, you know, certainly today people have much more information at their fingertips, and I think that can be a good thing, but it can also be overwhelming and be a source of kind of anxiety when there is a lot of conflicting information. So, yeah, I kind of empathize with the average person today who is exposed to a lot of information. And at the same time, I think we're in a better place than ever to disseminate information as individuals. So, pros and cons of kind of the space we find ourselves in today, but it is what it is. And I enjoy, you know, playing my part and trying to provide some clarity.
So you're speaking to two guys who are carnivores and would probably take quite a lot of convincing to follow a plant-based diet. So we got a few questions for you. I'm curious to know, first of all, when did that journey start for you? And then secondly, we'll do that one first because we got a load of questions after that.
Sure. Yeah, let's rewind 12 years ago. And if you guys were visiting me in Melbourne, I would have been the first to book the steak restaurant. So I'm with you there.
Mm.
And I always say, I love steak. The steak tastes delicious. And that hasn't changed, for me today. My food choices have changed. And it took me looking at the research objectively and with some humility, and then also thinking about what are my goals? What am I optimizing for? And my number one priority that I'm optimizing for is to be healthy into my 50s, 60s, and 70s. And when I look at the data across all of the different types of study designs we have, it's abundantly clear that while we can't sit here and say there's one perfect diet, I don't think we can do that. There is a theme, a set of characteristics which time and time again are associated with better blood pressure, better ApoB, better inflammation levels, lower risk of having a heart attack, a stroke, developing diabetes, lower risk of developing fatty liver disease and having these metabolic complications, including certain types of Alzheimer's. And these diets tend to be diets that are high in fiber. They are diets that have a bias towards unsaturated fats. Then they're not, they could be, but they're not, they're not low fat across the board. And we can get into that because I think that has been a big misunderstanding. There was a lot of demonization of fat without the context of not all fat is the same. These are diets that have a bias towards plant protein, but can have animal protein in them. And they're diets that are very low in ultra processed foods. And what I just described to you, you could then go and take those sets of characteristics and you could cut that a number of ways. It could be a healthy Mediterranean diet. It could be a pescatarian diet. It could be a completely plant exclusive diet. And it could be low carb. It could be moderate carb. It could be high carb. And that is what we see across the literature. And now what I just explained to you, that's not a very sexy, it's not a headline grabbing position. And, probably one of the reasons why it's not kind of spread so much across the internet. And we see more extreme positions get a lot more engagement and kind of social interaction. But looking at all of that evidence, I realized there are changes that I get to make to my own diet. Back when I was in my 20s, my diet did not reflect those characteristics. It was very high in saturated fat. I was eating a ton of meat. It was low in unsaturated fats. It was low in fiber relative to what we would say is optimal. And it was low in ultra processed foods. I never had a diet that was really rich in ultra processed foods. My diet was based on whole foods. So for me, it was looking at all of that, and that was and still has kind of stood up over time as a decision which I believe will hold me in good stead in future decades. And at the same time, it's not that I have to make a compromise to my health today. So there are ways where you can optimize for long term and at the same time still be optimizing for whatever your goals are today. And I think that takes a bit of learning, particularly in a society where we, like I mentioned before, I love meat. And we have a strong bias as a society towards animal protein in particular. And we don't like to necessarily hear things that are not reinforcing the things that we love. So I understand why this message might be unpopular to some. I believe it's rooted in science. And if we're truly sitting here and saying, you know what, I just want to be objective and I don't want to make a decision based on societal norms or emotion, then that dietary characteristic or theme is in my view, the evidence-based decision to make for long-term health.
I mean, without grabbing headlines, your book, The Proof is in the Plants, is a headline. The proof is in the plants means that objectively, this is the best diet, as you said, to live healthy in 50s, 60s, and 70s. So the conversation we're having, and I think something around the Mediterranean diet, I'm very happy you mentioned that, if it's pescatarian driven or it's just plant-based, has been shown to be the most quote-unquote healthy one for that regard. The one thing that I want to take away, and this is probably, if we're going for the 100 percentile, then let's say plant is the best way to go. But do we understand what the difference is between 100% and pescatarian or 100% and animal protein?
No. I mean, the short answer is there will be people that are out there that might argue that a plant-exclusive diet is best, but I don't think you can support that with data. If you're looking at human health, like, we don't have the studies to compare a healthy plant-exclusive diet to a healthy pescatarian diet. A lot of the data that we have in short-term trials is more looking at a Mediterranean diet versus a standard control, or a pescatarian diet versus standard control, or a vegan versus standard control. And once you start comparing very healthy diets with very healthy diets, you can imagine you don't really see much difference.
But here comes a question, and this is something that I think, again, Mike and I, former athletes, you've been around sports all the time. There's a certain thing where when you sacrifice something that you love very deeply, your body responds to it in a positive way. Is there something where it's more psychologically based? I'm going to say no to the steak that you loved 18 years ago or 10 years ago even, and then your body responds to it even stronger. Is that something, that's the sacrifice that I'm bringing to live healthier, that you think that gives you the additional push? So the data is not strong enough to say, I don't need the animal protein. But psychologically, because you're sacrificing it, you believe it will pay you back more fold in the future. Is that something that's there? Like, when I was an athlete, I didn't drink alcohol until I was 28. And I was like, this is my sacrifice. I could probably still perform the same with drinking, but because I don't do that, I'm going to push myself more.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. And I think that maybe that is a part of it. For me personally, and the way that I approach this, just to get a little clearer here, is, so I think there's that kind of theme that I outlined. But then I think at the individual level, and this is where everyone gets to play around with it, you're looking at important biomarkers and you're feeling how you respond. This is why you can't just have a blanket recommendation for everyone. So I went through that and was looking at those key biomarkers like ApoB, or back then LDL cholesterol, I was mostly interested in, and blood pressure and markers of inflammation and blood glucose control and all of these things. And I'm looking, and this is how I recommend anyone kind of does this, implements this, or makes changes, is looking at how those are responding. For me, to get my ApoB and LDL cholesterol down to a favorable, what I'd say an optimal level, I have to get towards that plant exclusive end of the spectrum. I have different genes to you and to Mike, so I respond differently to fats, and we can go into that. But that's all kind of what I would recommend to at an individual level. But maybe to double click on performance a little bit more, because I don't want to kind of be misconstrued here or just be unclear. And this has become clearer over the years. I think if you had asked me 5 to 10 years ago, are you sacrificing performance a little bit by making this change and consuming all plant protein instead of animal protein? I would have said, look, maybe a little bit. We don't know yet because it's not clear. But since then, we've had an abundance of clinical trials that have been published that have made it very clear, at least for healthy adults, when you are consuming enough total protein, we don't see significant differences in the outcomes that most people care about, which is the building of muscle mass and strength. So that's what I mean when I say I don't think this is a decision about, optimizing for long-term health at the expense of today's health if you formulate it in a kind of thoughtful way.
Yeah, the genetics things is quite interesting because I think similar to you, a year or two ago, my dad had a heart attack. Now it wasn't like a major full-on heart attack, but it was like enough where he needed surgery and he needed to get some stents put in his heart. And that got me thinking, is that something I need to be careful of because it's genetic and it might run in the family? Or is it just because he was eating a particular type of way and just not exercising? Because realistically, he definitely doesn't eat and train like I do. But then there is that concern where I think, or maybe because he's suffered from it and it can potentially run in the family, do I then need to change up my diet a little bit to ensure that that doesn't happen to me? And I'm sure you probably felt the same way after experiencing your dad go through that. All of a sudden you're thinking, well, okay, first of all, how can I ensure that doesn't happen to me? And what else can I do to optimize my health and well-being?
Yeah. And I mean, that's exactly how I felt. And I kind of, I ran through the same thought process as you, Mike. I was asking the same questions because, my dad was representative of a typical Australian kind of father. He had a heart attack at 41, but he was by no means, doing the level of exercise that we would say is optimal or, eating the diet that we would say is optimal for heart health. But I think that the reality here is that most of us would have some type of genetic component. But the reason that a lot of these diseases are running in families, yes, could be explained by some genes, but a lot of the time is explained by the fact that we adopt the same lifestyle. And so we have to be able to separate that out. And then this ultimately comes back to knowing what are the risk factors. So for you, it's doing a full audit. We know the most established risk factors for cardiovascular disease. Okay, your dad had a heart attack. You might have some genes that are working against you. So let's look under the hood. Where are these risk factors like ApoB and Lp(a), and where's your average blood pressure at on the daily? And then you can start there objectively, right? Make these measurements, and there's a suite of things that you could measure that very strongly predict cardiovascular disease. And based on where they're at, you can then make very informed decisions with evidence-based interventions. Okay, I want to actually shift that down and optimize that. Let's go and let's change a lifestyle choice. And then we'll remeasure it in 8 to 12 weeks. Like that's the approach I would recommend for you and for anyone really, instead of just like blindly making changes or blindly assuming that you're genetically at risk and making changes. Like let's measure things first and go from there.
When you said prior that it's been proven that as long as the amount of protein is enough, the source is not is probably secondary. Now, we had Lane Norton here last week. He's like, after a lot of trial and error, he came to the 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram. I saw content with you where you said between 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram plus minus. One of the myths that I mentioned in the beginning that you've probably been exposed to was that plant protein is being absorbed worse than animal protein. So you have to consume more plant protein to get to, quote unquote, the same level of absorption. Can you maybe share on that? How much truth is to that?
This is where context really matters, Vadim. So I mentioned earlier, I think we also need to think about like the different levels of study designs that we have available to us and what matters to the individual. So I would bet that if we had an individual sitting in front of us and we were talking about this and we said, what do you care most about? Do you want to talk about protein absorption percentages, or do you want to talk about your ability to build muscle and strength? I think most people would say the latter.
Muscle.
It's about muscle and strength. So that's where I like just to start there, canvas the conversation there, and then we can drill down. When we now have multiple clinical trials looking at protein intakes at that level that Lane stated there, where they compare completely vegan diets to omnivorous diets. So you have a vegan diet that all proteins coming from plants, and then the omnivorous diet is really representative of a typical Western omnivorous diet where 60% of the protein is from animal and 40% is from plant. And in these studies that span 10 to 12 weeks, they put them through resistance training. They measure muscle mass, they measure strength. There's no significant differences. So even if there was any differences in the absorption of protein in those two diets, you don't see it in those outcomes that people care about. So that would be the first thing that I would just say. And when you drill down and you look at actually human studies, so not animal studies, looking at the absorption of animal and plant proteins, and this has kind of been borne out more in probably like the last 5 years, the differences in absorption and utilization is probably only a few percent. It was overstated and has been overstated, and that's generally accepted by protein researchers in animal models who have a different set of absorb protein in a different way to humans. Where I would agree that animal protein has an edge on plant protein is when you're not consuming an optimal amount. Mm-hmm. When you're not up at what we would say is optimal at a moderate to high level, and so you have an insufficient kind of concentration of total amino acids, animal protein has a better amino acid profile than plant protein. That difference seems to go away when you get to a higher protein intake. But if we're sitting here and we're talking to someone who's not tracking protein, or in a country where they don't have a lot of protein access, that needs to be considered. Totally. I think that would be an unfair position for someone to hold. So the whole conversation around superiority of animal protein over plant, it seems to wash away and disappear as you get up to higher protein intakes. And that's kind of the main point that I want to underscore. And I will say that those studies have been done in healthy adults. And you guys have probably heard yourselves that as we get older, we develop like an anabolic resistance. So we become a little less sensitive, or this is the hypothesis. We become less sensitive to resistance training and to protein. And so there is a general school of thought out there that as we age, we maybe even need more protein, right? Mm-hmm. To be able to turn muscle protein synthesis on. And we hadn't seen a study comparing a vegan diet to an omnivorous diet in elderly population until this year. So that Luc van Loon, who is based in the Netherlands, he's one of the prominent protein researchers in the world. He conducted a study looking at muscle protein synthesis, which is it's kind of a surrogate short-term marker. When you're not going to run a trial that goes 10 to 12 weeks like the ones I just mentioned and measure actual muscle mass and strength, which would be gold standard. If you have less time and less funds, then you'll see studies measure muscle protein synthesis, which is more looking at just like the synthesis of protein on a daily basis. And we use that to say, okay, that probably associates and tracks with muscle mass and strength. And he took an elderly group of people, they were 72 years old on average, and had them do a vegan diet and then an omnivorous diet. So in like a crossover way, every subject did both diets. And he set the protein intake at 1.1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram. So this is why I found this study interesting, because he didn't jack the protein right up. And my hypothesis of that, if you had said, what do you think the outcome of this study will be, based on previous trials that he'd done and others had done, I would have thought the omnivorous diet was more anabolic. Mm-hmm. But there was no difference. So daily muscle protein synthesis was no different between the vegan diet and the omnivorous diet in that group of elderly at 1.2 grams per kilogram of protein intake. And he formulated that diet not based on protein powders, it was based on whole foods. And they used some like plant-based alternatives for certain meat products. And that was a big part of their discussion, was that this challenged their hypothesis and way of thinking. So this is an evolving space. And I think particularly in that cohort in elderly, I want to see that longer study now. Like, let's confirm that over 2 or 3 months and do strength training and measure actual muscle mass and strength in an elderly population. And if we don't see significant differences in that study, I'll have even higher confidence. But kind of until then, I'll hold this position loosely.
But from an audience perspective, takeaways, right? So if you're at the 1.2 grams or below, animal protein might be more beneficial from an metabolic perspective, especially the older you get. I think that's a statement. That plus minus.
Yeah, I'd say we could more confidently say that if you're at the RDA, which is like 0.8 grams per kilogram, which
even below that. Got it.
I don't think that that's optimal, and that we could double click on that if you want. But in short, I would say the RDA is not based on optimizing health. It's more based on getting sufficient amino acids to prevent deficiency.
I actually had a go at trying this a couple of years ago, 2018, but it was more so an experiment because I was curious, and at the same time I was going to document it for a YouTube video. So I went vegan for a full week and I documented everything. Now, it was an interesting experience, but firstly, now that I look back, I had no idea what I was doing. I would just go to the supermarket and I would buy anything that had remotely high protein and just didn't have anything related to animals in it. So at the time, I was trying to hit like some ridiculous protein intake of like 220 grams in total, which is already pretty high. And then at the same time, I was trying to like keep the fats low, like have like low fat days and then low carb days. And I found that was very difficult to do because to actually reach that protein target, naturally the carbs and the fats are going to be high anyway. And then secondly, I wasn't paying enough attention to two things, like what was the total amino acid chain profile that I was getting throughout the day. I was just randomly buying different vegetables and plant-based foods to just try and hit my targets. And also, I wasn't really that concerned about the quality. So because I was trying to hit that protein target, there was like this artificial garbage fake meat which I was consuming, which definitely didn't make me feel very good at all. And it made me realize that it can be done, but it just takes some time and effort to make sure you're buying good ingredients and then getting that well-rounded amino acid chain profile out of everything that you're eating. Because when I eat out at a restaurant and somebody else who knows what they're doing prepares a plant-based meal for me, it's delicious. You get me to try and figure out, what should I put together so that I hit my macros? It was like an absolute disaster and I just didn't enjoy it at all. So it was an interesting experience. Now, if I was to do it again, I would get a top vegan chef to do all the shopping, the best quality foods, and then prepare it in a way that tastes absolutely delicious. And I think I would survive. I think I would enjoy it.
I think you would. And I would say the amino acid kind of calculations, I was doing that as well. But to the point that I was making earlier, I don't think we actually need to calculate those if you're consuming enough total protein. Because we're seeing in those studies, like we're not seeing differences in these outcomes. So these subjects are getting enough amino acids when they're consuming 1.6 grams per kilogram, even all from plants. And if you go into like an app like, do you know Chronometer, that food tracking app, or you probably use other ones, but I use that one just because it breaks down the amino acid profile of the foods that you're logging into it. And I'll log my food here and there some days just to see where I'm landing. And typically I'm getting, 250, 350% plus of my daily individual essential amino acid requirements. So I think that takes care of itself, providing you're not really calorie restricted or protein restricted. The amino acids should take care of themselves. But I definitely agree with you. Going hard on the plant-based meat alternatives can be a little bit of a red herring. Some of them have a lot of sodium. Some of them are not actually low in saturated fat. Remember, one of like the big benefits of switching up to more plant protein is you're going to increase your fiber content, your consumption of these phytochemicals as well, these plant compounds that aren't in animal foods. You're going to increase your consumption of unsaturated fats and lower saturated fat. And if you go hard on plant-based meat alternatives, you might be increasing plant protein, but not getting all of those other benefits. So I think, they're not all the same as well. Like some of the plant-based meat alternatives are better than others. So you really need to read the labels on that stuff. But the other thing, Mike, is what I heard from you is a desire to kind of go completely vegan overnight, and that's very common. and it doesn't work for everyone. It might be that what works better for you is taking your existing meals that you already consume and having a chef work out a way to, instead of having 100% animal protein, it's 50-50. And like if you're having a bolognese sauce and it's currently minced meat, well, it might be minced beef with tempeh kind of crumbled through it, or tofu crumbled through it, or lentils or something else that's kind of mixed into it. And so this doesn't have to be an all or nothing. Back to what we were saying earlier about a dietary pattern and the science showing what is an optimal way to eat. Right now, the average person is getting 60 to 70% of their protein from animal protein and 30% from plant. And even if people could get that to 50-50, that would make a massive difference in their health and all of those biomarkers that are important indicators of long-term disease risk. So, I would just throw that out there so people don't feel overwhelmed that they have to make this crazy extreme change overnight, because often that is a little intimidating and hard to stick to.
When you do that diversity, is there evidence in terms of from a microbiome perspective how that diversity is helpful? Do we know that? Would we see this already?
We see generally that a more diverse microbiome is associated with better health. And in fact, Rob Knight, his work with the Human Gut Microbiome Project, I'm not sure if you guys have ever heard of this, but his group took 10,000 samples, stool samples. So they had people send in their poo to this lab. It's a lot of poo. And they analyzed the bacteria that was in the stool, because that's essentially a window into what's in your large intestine, your microbiome. And they asked these people a series of questions. So they got very familiar with like how these people were living, how they were eating, the things they were and weren't doing. And they were interested in, does the specific type of diet, like if someone's eating a vegan diet or a pescatarian or omnivorous or carnivore, does that reflect the diversity of the microbiome and the health of that ecosystem? And they actually found that it wasn't a specific diet that best predict the healthiest microbiomes. What predicted it was the number of plants in someone's diet, irrespective of whether it was an omnivorous diet or pescatarian or plant-based. It was the number of unique plants. And so from that, variety. And there's other research, the variety speaks to all of these plants contain different prebiotic compounds. Prebiotic essentially meaning fuel for our microbes. And you could break prebiotics down. It's really an umbrella term. It includes prebiotic fibre, resistant starch, and polyphenols. These escape digestion in the small intestine, and then they go into the large intestine, and they play a role in our health. And they fuel those microbes, and those microbes in turn, they're a little bit like our own pharmacy. As they are consuming those prebiotic compounds, they're dispensing drug-like compounds like short-chain fatty acids and other molecules that lower inflammation, improve blood glucose, improve cholesterol. So here again, this comes back to what we were saying at the beginning. The best predictor here was not, one diet. It was people having enough of these plants, which you can do with or without animal protein in your diet.
You just mentioned the blood glucose, and one of the trends from the wearables perspectives are obviously CGMs. What's your personal opinion on CGMs? And when people interpret them, are people interpreting them too highly, as in something very natural? You eat a banana, it spikes, it's okay, you're not going to die, you can still have bananas? Or is that something that, oh my God, you're responding way stronger to it, skip that out? Like, how should people look at those data points from your perspective?
I have reservations about these, but I'm open-minded. If they are studied further and show some validity, and if you were to say, hey, here's a study, we put these CGMs on people, and we can see that by them monitoring their post-meal glucose, it improved their diet quality and improved ApoB and improved HbA1c and improved blood pressure, like things we know actually predict disease, I would be much more interested in them. And I get worried for a few reasons. One is we have studies showing that your response to the exact same meal in the same individual can be wildly different, right? On different days, depending on your sleep, your stress, the amount of exercise you're doing. So if you looked on one day, your response to a banana could look completely different to another day. And so I think if someone without the right kind of understanding of this was to remove bananas based on single data point readings, that might not be such a wise move. The other thing is, like you pointed out, it's normal physiology for your blood glucose to go up after a meal. It's normal physiology for your heart rate to go up when you run and your blood pressure to go up when you run too, mind you. If we were just to have a blood pressure cuff on and I didn't tell you I was exercising, but you were watching that reading and you saw my blood pressure spike, you might tell me you shouldn't be doing whatever you're doing, but we know exercise is great for long-term health, right? So we have to be very careful of looking at an acute change and saying, this means this leads to a long-term problem. Okay? Acute change, I go to exercise, heart rate, blood pressure goes up. But long-term, I get long-term health adaptations from that behavior. So we have to be very careful of that. And what I see is a lot of confusion around optimal blood glucose levels. If you look at the kind of diagnosis of diabetes, we're very interested and concerned in like 2-hour post-meal blood glucose, which is how quickly does your glucose get back down to baseline? That's a key metric. But people are taking that 2-hour threshold and applying it to 5 minutes after a meal, which is totally wrong. The research doesn't say that your blood glucose should never go over that level. It just says it should be back down to this level by 2 hours. So I guess I have reservations around technology being used when it hasn't been fully clinically validated and people are not equipped with the kind of user manual instructions to actually put it to work and get some value out of it. That said, maybe further studies could validate the use of it. But until then, I think it's kind of best in people that have pre-diabetes and type 2 diabetes.
Is there any disadvantage to consuming too much fiber in your diet? Because from my experience and from some other people as well, when they suddenly introduce a lot of vegetables and fiber into all these meals, it's like their body is not used to that. And so they experience some bloating or excessive flatulence. Is this because they've chosen the wrong types of vegetables and plants, or is it something else?
There could be a few things going on here, but at a very high level, I would say that the experience of adding a lot of fiber quickly into someone's diet, the experience of getting bloating and flatulence is more common than not. And if we were to just really simplify this down to an analogy, like imagine you took someone who never trains at the gym and then you brought them in to do a workout with you, Mike, and they did your complete, leg session. They probably wouldn't be able to sit on the toilet for a week and there'd be all sorts of pain, right? So going low and slowly building up over time allows the microbiome time to adapt. We definitely know that. And it's not just working with people and anecdotes that shows us that. There's clinical studies. So Stanford 2 years ago now, Justin Sonnenberg, who's one of the main kind of microbiome researchers, he conducted a really eloquent study comparing fermented foods to fiber in healthy adults. And he was looking at how do these different foods or compounds of food affect inflammatory proteins. We know that the immune system is very tightly kind of controlled by or in a very tight relationship with the microbiome. 70% of the immune system lies in the gut. And in this study, they actually hypothesized that fiber would lower inflammation across the board. And they added the fermented food arm because probiotic foods are generally thought to be gut friendly, and they weren't sure how people would respond. And interestingly, subjects had significantly less inflammatory proteins, markers of inflammation, after consuming the fermented food diet, which added a considerable number of servings of fermented foods to their diet per day, of like kimchi and yogurt and kombucha and kraut. So a big tick for fermented foods there. But in the fibre arm, where they took people from 20 to 40 grams of fibre with a very small ramp up period, they saw very mixed results. Quite a lot of the participants had significantly increased inflammation. And they were interested in this and went back and looked at what was the baseline diversity of the microbiome in these subjects. And what they found was subjects who had very low microbiome diversity. So these could have been subjects who came into the study having a history of lots of antibiotic use, or they were coming into the study with very low fiber intakes and eating an ultra-processed diet or a carnivore diet. These subjects did not tolerate an increase in a doubling in fiber that quickly. It increased inflammation. Subjects who had lots of diversity did much better. And so that study doesn't completely tell us what's the best protocol for someone, but the hypothesis off the back of that study was that those participants needed to go much slower and introduce that fiber over a much longer kind of on-ramp. And that's something that they're going to test in future studies.
You just mentioned the word protocol, and I think protocols and stacks are the two things that most of us are building and continuing to build our whole life. I think one of my biggest, somebody asked me what my hobby is. I'm like, improving my daily protocol is probably my biggest hobby. When I just add every single minute, I want to be, am I optimizing? And I'm getting a huge kick out of it, because the things that I used to do, like intermittent fasting or 72-hour fast that I do weekly 5-6 years ago, so I'm completely gone. There's nothing here anymore. So it's constantly updating. But when you say protocol and you're like, okay, fiber here or fermented food there, most people will just ask, hey, Simon, what is actually what you do? What is your ideal day? Like when you don't travel, when you don't have a podcast with somebody in Dubai, like what's the ideal day, Simon's ideal day, in terms of food intake, knowing everything that you know today?
It might shock people how simple it is. I tend to like to keep it simple, but stay consistent with it. I find when I introduce too much and get too specific and complicated, things kind of fall off. So I would say high level, nutrition. I'm eating the diet that I've explained so far in this podcast, and protein intake would be around 1.6 grams per kilogram every day. I tend to wait a couple hours when I wake up until I eat, and I tend not to eat a couple hours before bed. And
so you work out fasted?
I train in the morning, and I usually train fasted, yes.
Yeah, me too.
And that works for me. It might not work for everyone, and they might feel low energy, and you have to play around with that, because if that's costing you intensity in your workout, then that might be something that you want to look at. So that's kind of my nutrition philosophy. And I, as you say, when I'm not traveling, I stick to that pretty well. And then sleep is really, really important. So the timing of the food at nighttime for me is really important. If I eat close to bed, my sleep is certainly, the quality is reduced a lot. But we're doing all the things at home where lights get dimmer and we put red light on at nighttime, and have a good sleep routine with consistency there. So I'll get solid 8 hours every night. That seems to then really affect the food choices I'm making and the exercise I'm doing or not doing. And exercise, I'll do resistance training, 4 days a week. I do dedicated cardio sessions 2 days a week. And then I play paddle. You guys know paddle, the sport, or padel?
It's huge here.
Depending on where you live. I love that sport, and not just for the cardio, mostly just for the banter and the fun and the laughter that comes with it. So I'll be playing that, 2 or maybe more times a week if I can squeeze it in, and that's a huge cardio workout. So that's kind of what exercise looks like. I'll throw, depending on where I am in the world, throw surfing into the mix there, which is also a really good workout. And those are like the most important staples. And then obviously there's supplements that I consume every day in the mix there. There's making sure that I really am socializing and not just hibernating. And I'm a workaholic naturally, so it's very easy for me to just put my head down and read and get work done and produce content. So something else that I kind of am very conscious of.
If you had to eat the same meals all over again, how would like your breakfast, lunch, dinner look like?
Well, that's a great question. I have a variation of a bowl a lot of the times, Vadim, where we'll roast a lot of vegetables. Like last night we did butternut, squash, kind of Okinawan sweet potatoes. We had a couple of different varieties of zucchini. So I love like roast vegetables that are seasoned nicely. I'm a big fan of rice, particularly when doing a lot of exercise. And I know controversial, but I don't think white rice is an unhealthy food. I think it's been demonized over the years. So I will have, white or brown rice or quinoa in there. And my go-to protein is like tempeh or tofu. So they'd be in there. And then for fats like avocado and olive oil and those sorts of kind of fat. But it would be a variation of that bowl and then just really mixing up the vegetables that I'm putting in there so that day to day or week to week, they're changing quite a bit.
What do you tend to do when you're on the move and you don't have access to good quality food? Because I know this is a big question I get. Everyone's like, oh, Mike, how do you stay in shape when you travel? And it's got to the point now where I do tend to travel in places where I know there's good gym facilities and there's good food because it just makes my life easier and I just enjoy it a lot more and I can maintain my physique. But I would imagine for you or anyone else who's plant-based, it becomes more of a difficulty because you could go to some of these restaurants that are technically good, but then they might not necessarily cater to vegans. So if you're in a scenario
little more planning.
where... Planning.
Sorry, you go.
Yes. So if you're in that situation, I'll shut up.
Sorry, you go, Dana. You go.
So if you're in that situation, would you eat a meal even though it's not necessarily that healthy, or would you skip the meal and wait for later on to have a better quality meal?
I tend to eat something when I'm out, and maybe that's just me trying to fit in and not be the guy at the table that's not eating anything. But I'll often find myself, if I'm at a restaurant and I'm like looking through and I know that this is going to be a lower protein meal, I will have kind of known probably earlier in the day that I'm going out for dinner, and I'll kind of front end my protein in that day. And then dinner might not be the perfect kind of, whole rounded meal that I would normally have, but I'd be at the restaurant and I'd really just try and, get some nutrient dense foods in, vegetables and things like that, and do my best in that scenario. And then if I'm choosing like where to eat, these days, most cities you can find pretty good options. Maybe it's not the same as cooking at home or in where you're used to kind of going to the grocery store or ordering in, but it's getting better and it's getting a lot easier. But I'm like you, like when a lot of the times where I'm going, if I'm going away on a holiday, I know that there's a great gym, or I'm going somewhere in Bali where I know that there's great food options, and it doesn't feel like a stressful kind of move for me in that way.
You mentioned that you sleep worse if you eat closer to going to bed. And obviously there's this 2-hour glucose window that we expect glucose to drop. There are some glucose hacks out there, apple cider vinegar or metformin, other things that people's trying to use. What do you think about those hacks, or did you find a hack that works for you best?
Certainly like vinegar will lower your postprandial blood glucose response. I think that whether or not you need to focus on these is very dependent on what your current blood glucose levels look like. if you're a very healthy person and you're exercising and you're not having any issues with blood glucose regulation, I don't think you need to be thinking about all of these hacks every single meal. If someone has pre-diabetes or type 2 diabetes, I think these things become more important. So, certainly fiber, adding fat to meals, things like apple cider vinegar over salads, and doing that prior to having a big meal. Like, these things can make a difference, but I'm really big on not overcomplicating things for the person that doesn't need to. And so what I see online a lot of the time is, as well as like, what are the big rocks here? If you're not doing exercise 5 times a week, don't think about apple cider vinegar on your salad. Like, that is shifting the needle in such a small way. Like, let's get our priorities straight. So don't miss the forest for the trees, essentially. And I think a lot of the time we're seeing all this fight online on the periphery, but most people aren't doing all of those basics. Get the basics in, and then let's fight on the peripheries.
Speaking of overcomplication, let's talk supplements. Because you mentioned prior that to balance it out, you would add supplementation. There's certain supplements there, but sometimes it feels like people are taking 40, 50, 60 different supplements, not knowing if they actually work, if they actually need them. Let's say we don't have access to the blood test, which would be obviously ideal, based on research and data, but also maybe just end of one, just your personal experience. What would you introduce into your daily stack for the audience perspective that is active, that is working out 3-4 times a week, that is looking after themselves, but wants to make sure that they have a balanced lifestyle?
I think most people can benefit from creatine monohydrate. And I think the dose of that, my current kind of recommendation, what I do is to base it off your body weight rather than just a strict 5 grams per day. I do like 0.1 grams per kilogram, which I think better standardizes that dose to how much muscle someone has and is reflective of the study. So for me, that's like 9-ish grams a day. And so I end up just kind of doing 2 scoops, which is 10 grams a day. But if someone's 50 kilograms, that would be 5 grams a day. So I'd say creatine, particularly for the muscle and strength outcomes, potentially bones, potentially some cognitive outcomes, but we may need a higher dose for the cognitive outcomes, but there probably needs to be a little bit more research done on that. DHA and EPA, omega-3s. So most people, regardless of what diet they're consuming, are not consuming enough fatty fish to get an optimal kind of omega-3 index, which associates with lower risk of cardiovascular disease, among other things. And if you want your omega-3 index to be at around 8%, which would be kind of bottom end of an optimal range based on the epidemiology we have anyway, for most people, that's going to take at least 1 gram of DHA and EPA a day, maybe more. Some of that's going to come down to genetics and if they're eating any fish alongside that. So getting a good DHA and EPA, that's providing at least 1 gram of active DHA and EPA. So not 1 gram of omega-3, because often you'll see underneath that, what is the actual active input of DHA and EPA? Active input of those two should equal at least 1 gram. You can go out and test your omega-3 index if you want to kind of titrate that dose accordingly. So that's 2, creatine, DHA, and EPA. I think if you're targeting at least 1.6 grams of protein per day, for most people, a protein powder, high quality protein, will make that easier and more convenient, particularly if you're someone on the go and traveling, and particularly if you're restricting calories. So high quality protein, and then I would say a multivitamin. For most people, if you're not testing your bloods, we do know that the average person out there is falling short in a number of important nutrients. It would be ideal to know exactly what you're falling short in and then kind of doing this in a bit more of a targeted way, but a good high quality broad spectrum multivitamin, I'm not against. And there is data now, some longer term trials that show us multivitamin use can be particularly beneficial for lowering risk of cognitive neurodegenerative diseases. So there's some kind of emerging data there, and I think generally people's opinions of multivitamins are starting to change a bit. There was some stigma there for a few years, so I would add a good quality multivitamin into the mix, and then depending on someone's diet and how much plant foods they're getting in, a prebiotic could be helpful as well.
Prebiotic before every meal or once a day?
Again, depends on someone's diet, I think. You could do it before every
diet.
Standard American diet before every meal. Your standard American diet's getting like 12 to 14 grams of fiber a day. And in reality, should be getting 30 grams a day as a minimum. So would I like them to eat more plant foods as a priority? Yes. Would they also benefit from a prebiotic supplement? Yes, probably.
Have you noticed people that are following a plant-based diet, are they potentially at risk of developing deficiencies in comparison to somebody who is not following plant-based, or have you not really noticed anything?
Yeah, there's going to be different nutrients of focus and nutrients that you could fall short on when you're adopting a plant predominant or a plant exclusive diet, no doubt. So whereas we see like in general population, omnivores are having more of an issue getting optimal amounts of folate and magnesium, those nutrients aren't a concern in a plant-rich dietary pattern. You're getting them in spades, but nutrients like vitamin B12, like iodine, sometimes zinc, calcium, these need to be focused on. And back to our planning kind of point that we made earlier, you can plan for these and you can ensure that you're getting enough through your diet and supplementation. But I certainly wouldn't be recommending someone adopts a plant predominant or plant exclusive diet and gives no consideration to these nutrients. You need to be aware of them. And at the beginning, you're learning something new. And so I think like some education and some tracking is important. So you're not flying blind here. But yeah, the risk of nutrient deficiencies is there. They're going to be different deficiencies to what we see in a general population who are consuming an omnivorous diet. But you can plan for them. And we've done this as a society. Like we introduced iodine into salt and into certain fortified foods in the 1900s because a number of people in our society were falling short in iodine. And that kind of public policy was able to arrest that situation such that very few people today are iodine deficient. So planning, whether it's as a government or at an individual level, to avoid nutrient deficiencies is not something new. But the easiest way, Mike, to cover that is just to take a good quality multivitamin. If you do that and you're eating a healthy, whole food or mostly whole food based diet, very unlikely you're going to fall short in something.
Yeah, I've heard Bionic is quite good.
Good plug.
Simon might have a different opinion. I stayed away.
No, I would love to learn more. I'd love to learn more.
Simon, listen, I would like to round up with some quick questions. It's been incredible. Again, to be completely transparent, and also for the audience, we were sitting there and they're like, we're going to talk about plant-based diets for an hour. I'm like we were walking into this. But I think your approach is one of the healthiest approaches. It's not clear how much better it is than others, but why would you risk it if this is already proven to be very good? And I think we both take away from that I think my personal takeaway right now is I need to increase variety. I need to increase variety of vegetables. I don't have to take out animal source for the sake of it. As long as the variety is there and I get to my protein levels, I'm probably good. I'm not perfect, but I'm good. And I think that approach is so much more, for me, digestible, literally digestible, than if somebody comes and says, do plant-based, you're going to live longer and better. So I personally really appreciate the way you position the data, the research that you have found, and also the impact on the life. So just before we're doing the quick questions. Now on the quick questions. What's an underrated food?
Dark leafy greens. Yeah. Per calorie, one of the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet.
And you would add that also in a daily, you would add that in every meal?
Oh, yeah. I have rocket or arugula and spinach and other dark leafy greens at every single meal. I throw them in smoothies. They're in every bowl. They are an underrated food. They should be a superfood. They're probably not expensive enough.
I always used to buy like bags of spinach and rocket and all these mixed leafy greens, and they would always sit at the bottom shelf of my fridge like, are you going to eat me? Like after 3 or 4 days, they'd just turn rotten and I just have to put them in the bin. It's like I need a reminder every day to be like, have at least a handful of it. But you're right. I mean, I've spoken to a lot of nutritionists, and even based on some of the blood work I've done, they all say you need to eat more leafy greens. So I would agree.
Next one, overrated supplement.
Overrated supplement. Creatine gummies.
That was a smart way out, by the way. You could have just said gummies. I see what you did there. I thought you were going to say something like ashwagandha or something like that, like where like, oh my God, it's testosterone booster or something like that. But okay.
Yeah. I mean, we could. There were many that were coming to my mind, but creatine gummies, just for the obvious reason of that, they may not actually contain creatine.
For certain brands that we don't want to discuss, or protein bars that don't contain protein.
Right.
3 biomarkers everybody should track.
I'd say number 1, this guy, blood pressure.
Yeah.
It's surprising how infrequent people are checking their blood pressure, and we tend to focus a lot on cholesterol and blood glucose. The number 1 risk factor responsible for most premature deaths globally is hypertension. It's high blood pressure. And you can be fit and healthy and go to the gym and do all the things, and you can have high blood pressure. Absolutely. People say it all the time. Very strong genetic component to your blood pressure regulation. So buying like that cuff I just held up, for those that maybe are listening and not watching, is an Omron cuff. I have no affiliation with them. They do very high quality cuffs for at home, and they're about $40. One of the best investments that you can make for your health. And it comes with a pamphlet. There's a set protocol for how you measure blood pressure at home. Follow that. Do it. I think at the beginning you should do it once a day for 7 days and take an average, and that gives you your kind of baseline. Very strong predictor of cardiovascular disease. So measuring your blood pressure is the first biomarker. Second biomarker, I'd say ApoB.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a bit, you guys have probably spoken about this before, a slightly more specific, better predictor of atherosclerosis. So that type of heart disease where you get narrowing of the artery and then have a heart attack or a stroke. So you can measure ApoB now. A lot of the online blood test companies are offering it, or you can speak to your doctor about adding it on, and hopefully they will. Most doctors now are starting to become aware of it. So say those 2. Third biomarker. There's so many here. So this forcing me to put it into 3. I think your waist circumference to height ratio. That might seem a little strange. Does that seem strange?
Nowhere. Yes, that seems very strange.
Yeah. It combines a lot of blood glucose, triglycerides. It combines a lot of these other biomarkers and is a very, very strong predictor of metabolic disease. So all of the metabolic diseases, type 2 diabetes, metabolic associated fatty liver disease, and so I would keep an eye on waist circumference to height ratio. I can provide you guys with like where people should land for these things as well, maybe for the show notes.
Please do.
But that's a pretty simple one for people to measure, and it's going to be very indicative of their risk of metabolic disease. So in those 3 tests, you're really getting a very affordable way to understand your risk of cardiometabolic disease, which is what is robbing most people of healthy years of life.
I'm curious to know what the other 2 would be.
If people have access and could afford it, VO2 max testing for general cardiorespiratory fitness, and some type of strength test, I think. Like even though a basic grip strength seems silly, a grip strength is very correlative and indicative of overall body strength. So adding those 2 in, you're really assessing cardiorespiratory fitness and then sort of musculoskeletal fitness. And now we're getting a very all-rounded kind of 5 markers that are going to be looking into different systems of the body: cardiovascular system, metabolic system, musculoskeletal. You're kind of forcing me to put it into 5. That would probably be the top 5.
And last
one. At least on the spot. Yeah.
Last one. What did you change your mind on recently?
Oh. I think over the last 10 years, it's become clearer how dairy associates with health. And a lot of the times, confusion when related to a food and how it affects health is because we're not considering context, the dose, the specific type of food. Like, what is dairy? It's such a broad category. For who and for what. And it's become clearer that like certain dairy foods appear to be favorable for cardiovascular disease. So we're starting to see that fermented sources of dairy, foods like kefir and yogurts and certain cheeses, seem to have a neutral or probably a beneficial effect on cardiovascular health. And that's been a real changing, I think, of the nutrition science academic kind of world's view over the past decade, where dairy tended to be lumped into the group of harmful for cardiovascular disease. But when you actually look at individual foods, while foods like butter can significantly raise like ApoB, and we know that's not something that you'd want to do, these other foods are having a very different effect on cardiometabolic risk factors. So that would be one. And then, back to the protein kind of conversation that we had earlier. In elderly, I thought at one point 2 grams per kilogram animal protein would be more anabolic, and the early signs are that that's not the case. So another position where I've kind of shifted slightly. I'm a little bit more optimistic that animal protein and plant protein are not different in terms of anabolic properties at those protein levels.
Do you ever consume animal meat at all, or is it strictly no?
No, haven't consumed animal meat since 2015.
Fair enough.
Simon,
I could.
Thank you so much for your time.
And I just haven't. And you might be wondering, like, why does he not consume a little bit? And that's a question I've asked myself as well. Like, would plant predominant be better or easier for me to follow, like particularly out in social circumstances? I have a few reasons why I don't do plant predominant, why I stick to plant exclusive. But right near the top of this list, and I wrote about this in my book, is that I have a very addictive personality, and I need a line in the sand. If I start to introduce these foods, I know I'm going back to where I was in my 20s when meat dominated my diet. And so sitting here as someone who knows that they love the taste of meat, to me, it's just not worth introducing a small amount, because it's going to take me away from this diet that is keeping me really healthy, and I believe will keep me really healthy for a long time.
Awesome, man. Again, Sam, thank you. Thanks so much for your time. Appreciate it. I mean, we learned a lot for ourselves in terms of impact, and I think some of the myths that we were around. Some of the statements I listened to with a smile, where one of the realest statements was around the CGM, where you would hesitate to recommend them, was probably one of the strongest statements we ever heard on the pod, because everybody's so politically correct these days because nobody wants to step on anybody's toes. So everybody's trying to avoid answering questions, but that was the most concrete. Not right now, guys. Let's wait for some evidence before we can continue to using them. So I really appreciate transparency, appreciate the personal touch and approach and sharing with us. You might have not converted us to plant-based diet just yet, but we're definitely going to put some extra dark leaves and some zucchini in that, and remove some part of that minced beef out of the bolognese. Appreciate your time. Thank you so much. For the audience going forward, where can they find you? Where can they find out more about you?
So my podcast is The Proof. You can find that on YouTube or Spotify or Apple. And my thing is really sitting down with academics who don't have a platform and tend to speak at conferences and are not doing a podcast tour. So you'll find a lot of interesting people that you may have never heard of before. But I think they're interesting. And so we sit down and nerd out on these things. And then on Instagram, just searching Simon Hill, and you'll find me on there. And my website's theproof.com.
Thank you very much, Simon. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Vadim. This was really enjoyable. Great to hang out.